So many physicians are now less likely to prescribe a statin for their patient, which I think is a very good trend. Because until recently, if you had a slightly elevated total cholesterol, very likely you left the office with a prescription for a statin. And statins are not without risk, of course. But the other thing that we have to understand is that cholesterol was misunderstood for quite some time as well. And when we look at a lipid panel, what I always look at is your HDL and your triglycerides. And if the HDL is very high, which is a good value, it's actually protective, heart protective, and your triglycerides are low, then your LDL is really secondary to me. Now, there is, of course, still a correlation between a very elevated LDL cholesterol and heart disease, but it's a crude relationship. Also, we have to understand that LDL cholesterol is also valuable, right? And drastically driving it down. And you see some physicians, at least in the past, they would say, oh, look how great, your total cholesterol is very, very low. We drove it down to, you have 140 total cholesterol. And your LDL is 90 or 80, and that's, of course, make them very happy. But that is a bit misunderstood. And LDL does have a value. It's not this evil molecule that is only doing harm. We actually need it for many functions. Okay, it has a lot of positive functions as well. So now that we understand this a bit better and focus more on the whole lipid panel, again, if your HDL cholesterol is high and your triglycerides are low, then the LDL is much less of a risk factor for you. So first, what can we do to increase our HDL and lower triglycerides? And that is actually decrease our total carbohydrate intake, especially simple sugars. That has a profound impact. Now, you can also go too far with this. And you see in some people that go to the extreme of, let's say, a ketogenic diet, yes, they will have an HDL that goes up, triglycerides down, but sometimes then the LDL shoots up very high. But within reason, I would say on a low carbohydrate diet, somewhere between 100 and 150 grams of carbohydrates per day, what we often see is that HDL goes up and your triglycerides come down. And that's actually very valuable. That's very heart protective. That is a very good trend that we'd like to see. Now, LDL is not always directly influenced. Sometimes in a low carbohydrate diet, LDL cholesterol comes down as well, but sometimes it might go up. And as I mentioned before, if you have a very extreme restriction of your carbohydrates, it may go up very high. And sometimes we call this lean mass hyperresponders, where people then suddenly have a very high LDL. And there is a community that says, well, we don't really care about this much. We don't think this is related to heart disease. That's a topic that's a bit complicated. I think overall, we can probably agree that yes, LDL cholesterol, if it is very high, can predict heart disease. It's a very crude measurement, and we shouldn't do drastic measures to lower it too much, but we can monitor that as well. So again, if you're on a low carbohydrate diet and your HDL is good and your triglyceride is good, and you still want to work on your LDL cholesterol a bit, there's certain things that you can do to help with that as well. And I always recommend, besides lowering your total carbohydrate intake, especially as you get older, also lower your total fat intake. Now, I do like fats. Fats, of course, are essential. The two macros that we absolutely need are proteins and fats. Carbohydrates, of course, are very secondary. We can do without carbohydrates for quite some time because your body can make its own. But in terms of if we want to influence our LDL cholesterol dietary-wise, we can. It's a small percentage because remember, 85% of your LDL cholesterol is made by the liver. If you take in less cholesterol, if you're lowering your LDL dietary-wise, sometimes the liver just makes more. And if you eat more LDL heavy foods, then your liver will make less. So it's kind of an adaptive process, but you can somewhat influence it with your diet. And I would certainly say lowering your total fat intake for the day is helpful, especially as you get older, because fat is calorically very dense. And then if we look at the fat intake, I still prefer monounsaturated and saturated fats. So we're talking about olive oil, avocado oil, and then butter, ghee, whatever you want to eat, but again, very small amounts. The problem I see with a lot of people is that they go overboard. And especially when someone is on a ketogenic diet, they might just guzzle fats, which you don't really have to do. You have enough body fat usually that, your body is able to mobilize that. And eating fat in moderation is, I think, even there, the better choice, in my opinion. So if you want to lower your LDL cholesterol, then you can, to some extent, do that with dietary choices by lowering your total fat intake. And that's usually around 60 to 80 grams per day. And it's easy to get there. So I usually don't add a lot of oil to the food that I'm preparing. Once in a while, I use a bit of butter. I might use some avocado oil, but very small amounts. And before, I would just pour that into the pan. Now I'm measuring it out because it's easy to forget how much you put into that pan when you soak that food in there, and you will eat it all. And it is a very calorically dense macro, obviously, and it's easy to go over your total calories for the day by just guzzling those fats. Small amounts, again, are fine. Now, the fats that I usually take in daily come from the foods I'm eating, and there might be some in red meat, there might be some in eggs, of course, and some of the other foods that I'm consuming. But then the amount I'm adding in when I'm preparing the food, I try to keep that to a minimum. So 60 to 80 grams of total fat per day is realistic in my opinion. And then again, 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrates per day. Protein, I like to have that on the higher side. I keep talking about that 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. That is usually working well for most people. So if you structure a diet in that way, then you can certainly increase your HDL cholesterol, you can lower your triglycerides, and you can to some extent also influence your LDL cholesterol. So I think most people will not need that statin. Now, when is a statin needed? A lot of times that is if you had a history of heart disease or if there's a strong history of heart disease in your family. Now, in this case, the statin's purpose is not just to lower your cholesterol, specifically LDL cholesterol here, but also to protect the heart by having an anti-inflammatory factor there. And this anti-inflammatory effect is cardioprotective. So yes, if you had heart disease, if you had a heart attack, or if there's a strong family history, sometimes a statin is useful. Then though, also one thing to consider is, and they did some studies on this, that you don't always have to go to a very, very high amount of that statin. Sometimes a low dose of a statin is actually sufficient here. And higher doses are not necessarily more protective. Because again, we're not really looking at the endpoint of having a lower LDL cholesterol here, but more of the anti-inflammatory properties of this. And I think a lot of physicians either don't understand that or they just want to have the simple lab readout and say, hey, look, I'm giving you the statin, your cholesterol is coming down, it's working just fine. And I think that's a simplified view to look at it. But yes, statins will have a point. I think it's a valuable medication in a certain patient population, but it's way overprescribed in my opinion. And a lot of the parameters that we can change with our dietary choices, exercise, and of course, maintaining a lower body fat, because that's the other thing I have mentioned earlier. Weight loss, being at a more ideal body weight will certainly improve your lipid markers as well. So these are parameters that we can influence through our dietary choices and exercise. We can maintain an ideal body weight and we can control the amount of carbohydrates coming in. And that makes a huge difference already. And then if we also monitor our fats and we only have good fats in very small amounts, so a lot of times that's sufficient to change your lipid panel parameters where now they're heart protective rather than concerning for your heart health overall.